My name is Tim Arth. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I work with ACPA College Student Educators International. We wanted to thank you very much for attending today's online learning event, creating curriculum facilitation guides for crisis and emergency learning experiences, being brought to you by Paul Gordon Brown and Erin Simpson. Before we start, we'd like to let you know about a couple of the features that the Shindig online learning system that we're partnering with Shindig to utilize today offers. First, if you'd like to go ahead and have a live transcription of today's online learning event, please click the click here for live transcription button, and that will open up a separate screen for you to go ahead and view the live transcription. In addition, if you have questions during today's online learning event, please go ahead and submit them via text by clicking on the !ask button, or by clicking on the raise your hand button as a cue to us to bring you up onto the stage to ask a video question. If you'd like to go ahead and connect with others who are in the online learning event room today, you can go ahead and click on their thumbnail, and that will go ahead and enable you to connect with them during the presentation today. At this point, we'll go ahead and do ACPA's land acknowledgement. ACPA College Student Educators International is the leading comprehensive student affairs association that advances higher education and engages students for a lifetime of learning and discovery. Although serving an international audience, our membership is primarily from the United States, and our offices are headquartered in Washington, D.C. at the National Center for Higher Education. Related to our mission of supporting and fostering learning through the generation and distribution of knowledge, ACPA acknowledges the painful history of genocide in the United States for Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous peoples. We honor and respect the many and diverse tribal nations and peoples who were forcefully removed from, as well as those still connected to, this land. We particularly acknowledge and recognize that the land upon which our international headquarters is located today has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous people, including the Akahonik, Pocomoke, Piscataway, Anacostank, Mattapiniant, Nangamek, Pamunkey, Tahihant, Nanticoke, Chickahominy, Monacan, Mattapani, Nansemond, Rappahannock, Anistohini Unami, and Assateague tribal nations as the original occupants of the Washington, D.C. region. ACPA strongly advocates for higher education and student affairs professionals to honor the land, the original tribal occupants, and the history of the place where you are located. Further, we have a responsibility to continually self-educate, reflect, and listen to the histories and people in our areas. Including tribal land acknowledgements and practice, and understanding and acknowledging history is not only respectful and educational, it is the justice-oriented advocacy necessary for continuing the work of dismantling the devastating effects of settler colonialism in our society. Thank you. At this point, I'll go ahead and bring our presenters to the stage.
I don't know who may be talking right now, but so you know, Erin, you are a black screen to me. So I'm going to reinitialize this. And if you want to go ahead and start, that would be excellent.
Absolutely. Great. Hi, y'all. My name is Erin Simpson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve as the director for the Gender and Equality Center at the University of Oklahoma. I would ask that folks give us just a little bit of technological grace today. We did try this out last Friday. Everything went great, but Paul and I apparently keep turning into just blank mute boxes for each other. So please give us a little bit of grace as we are going through today. Paul, I introduced myself and asked for forgiveness. I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself now too. Or I think you might be frozen. Okay, so Paul, are you there with me?
I am. Hopefully for a little while, we'll see what happens, but I can hear you now.
Great. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Great. Yes, my name is Paul Brown. I work as a director at the software company Roompact. Tim, if you want to move the slide forward. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I've worked with curriculum for a number of years. I've been on the Institute faculty on the curricular approach for a number of years, and do this a lot in my daily life. That's a little bit about me.
Perfect. Let's get started. Tim, if you want to advance the slide. All right, Paul, are you there?
I'm back.
All right. You wanna hit here first?
Sure. So a little bit about why did we choose this topic? And one of the things is we talk a lot about writing facilitation guides, but Erin did some really innovative work at Oklahoma and thinking about what about facilitation guides for things maybe that we can't plan for, that we know are probably going to happen. We might not know what the particular details of those might be, but are there ways that we can turn some crisis and emergency situations into learning opportunities? I'm sure that many of you on your campuses have procedures in place for emergency and crisis response that focus on the operational aspects of it. So, who gets notified? Does someone need to do this? What alerts get sent out? But knowing that a curricular approach uses a learning-focused lens, are there ways that we can then also create some guides for making sure that the student learning comes out of it and that students are taking things away from it? So these are intended really to be beyond the safety aspects, right? Those definitely need to be in place. But what are the other things that can occur? And so if you want to click to the next slide, Tim, we're going to talk a little bit about utilizing this approach with facilitation guides. Now, we're going to use two terms. Curricular approach and residential curriculum. We're going to use those pretty much interchangeably. The original term that was often used was residential curriculum because it was a residence life. It was born out of residence life. We since use the term curricular approach because really it can apply to any department, regardless of whether you're residence life or not. But we are going to use both of those terms kind of interchangeably. So if you hear one or the other, we're referring to the same thing. Next.
I'm just gonna jump in. Paul gave me some lovely credit here, and we did start this work in residence life at the University of Oklahoma, but now I work in a gender equity center, and there are just as many emergency situations that I need emergency facilitation guides for. Some of the examples we'll show you later are the tried and true ones that I used in residence life, but I want to be clear that this can be used across the Division of Student Affairs, and honestly probably should be. It helps keep our entire division on board, and so we've expanded that work at this time.
Yeah, and a majority of you are likely coming from a residence life perspective, I would imagine, that are on this particular webinar. But it also represents a great opportunity for collaboration with other departments, especially depending on what those issues that may arise might be. You might work with one office more so than another. Next slide, please. So before we jump into this, I'm going to give you a brief history of a curricular approach, just to make sure that everyone's up to speed before we jump into some of the details about what a facilitation guide may look like. Next slide. So if we look at the history of the curricular approach and we look at the timeline of student affairs history, next slide, the majority of this movement kind of starts to emerge in the mid-90s. So you'll see the student learning imperative comes out in 1994, powerful partnerships in 98, learning reconsidered at the beginning of the 2000s. And this is really the genesis of where the philosophy of the curricular approach as we now define it kind of came to be. It always existed in some elements and forms. Some folks in first year programs and orientation have been doing a curricular type approach themselves for quite a while. We also experimented with it with living learning communities. So really a curricular approach is both new and not new. Next slide. Where we really trace the curricular approach back to is this article from in 2006 by Kathleen Kerr and Jim Tweedy at the University of Delaware. And they were the first to apply it to residence life and really think about it through a classroom-centric lens. And so they wrote up their experiment in this article in 2006 and said, hey, we haven't totally figured this out, but we think this has value and we think it's going somewhere. And we want to put it out into the literature to see how people react. Another thing that happened, next slide, is they approached ACPA and said, maybe we could start an institute on this process so that we could begin to explore it more. So you'll see the first one there was in 2007, so a year after that About Campus article came about. The attendance was only about 30 to 40 people, and it was really very exploratory. It was almost like a meeting of minds and just talking through things, very different from the experience that you may go to at the Institute today. So fast forward to the present, coming up in October, Anaheim, many of you are probably going to be able to join us. We did close this year again, so unfortunately some people won't be able to join us, but we're now in our 13th iteration of this, and it's really been collectively through all the faculty that we figured out what does this really mean. So it's kind of hard to say, you know, who developed the curricular approach. I think of course, the majority of credit goes to Jim Tweedy and Kathleen Kerr at Delaware for starting this process, but a lot of the refinement and further knowledge has come through a lot of different people, so much so that we don't really always know who to give exact credit to. So we have to give credit to that whole group. Next slide. There's a few schools that have been doing this for a while, and I just want to highlight them. When folks ask me, what are some of the institutions that are maybe doing this the best? I think the list that I point them to most often is the folks that have done showcase sessions at the Institute, because these folks have been vetted by the faculty. They went through some kind of interview process. There's rubrics involved. I'm leading up that process this go around. But these are some of the schools. These are some examples of ones that are doing it on the divisional level. Next slide. And these are the ones that are doing it on a residence life level. So if you're looking at folks that you're like, hey, I want to learn more, I would look through this listing of institutions to find the schools that might be most applicable to you. Next slide. So fast forward now to 2017, Kathleen Kerr and Jim Tweedy and a few others do a follow-up article in 2017. This really codifies the knowledge that came out of the Institute over the past 10 years. So if you're looking for a good primer that gives you all the basics, this is usually the article that I would point you towards. We've learned a lot of things, we've refined a lot of things. A lot of schools are doing some innovative approaches kind of off this base, and so that's where you can find most of that information. Next slide. Now, I want to say a little bit about this word curriculum, because some schools will do a curriculum and not call it a curriculum. It can be potentially a politically charged word depending on who's on your campus and who's deemed responsible for the curriculum. So you'll notice that a lot of schools will use the word curriculum or not. We're going to use it here. The idea is really just that we're borrowing classroom-like structures and applying them to an out-of-class setting. That's really what, at its core, at its most simplest core, it is. Next slide. For curriculum, there's a few things I want you to remember. Curricular approaches are about getting everyone moving in the same direction. That's why you often define learning goals and outcomes, and you make that commonly known in the department. In prior approaches, what would often happen is you may have some general sense of what you want your goals to be, but then everyone would go off and do their own thing. Curricular approaches really try to build in consistency, because with consistency comes the ability for you to do improvement, because you can build off of it year after year. Next slide. Curricular approaches also use student learning as the starting point. They always go back to what is it we want students to learn? How can we best help them learn it? So when we talk about some of the facilitation guides today, they're really focused on that learning aspect. There might be some process portions to them. There might be some community development aspects to them. Those things are still important, but what a curriculum really does is focuses in on making sure that we're ensuring learning. Next slide. It doesn't leave it up to chance. This is one of the reasons why we have facilitation guides that actually kind of outline the things that we should do, because we are going to try to make some very specific choices in how these things might be facilitated so that we can make sure that it's not just left up to chance. Next slide. Curriculum is also just as much about process as product. So you might create an amazing facilitation guide that's going to be perfectly hitting on all the outcomes that you want. But if you're not including everyone that may be actually facilitating that in the creation process, or involving all the different partners who might have some import into that, you're not going to be successful. So it really has to be a team-oriented approach. Next slide. That's why curricular approaches are just as much about organizational change as they are about writing learning outcomes and goals and facilitation guides. The process stuff is just as equally important. Next slide. Another thing I like to highlight about curricular approaches is they're about doing less so that you can do more. The idea behind this is you're not just adding this on as one more thing to do, but you're taking a critical look at what is our mission, what are the things that fit best with that mission, and what are the things that are maybe nice to do but ancillary. So let's focus on the things that are squarely within our goals and outcomes, that we know have the highest impact, that we can do the best and pour our resources into that rather than stretching ourselves too thin. Next slide. So that's why we talk about curricular approaches as really a paradigmatic shift. This is going to go beyond what we're going to address in this webinar today, but I also want to mention that because this isn't really just a plug and play that you go, oh, great, we'll just develop facilitation guides, go, we're done. It's part of a whole process that's beyond what we can certainly teach you in an hour. That's why there is a multi-day institute on the topic. All right, next slide. So to give you just a little bit of structure, programming models, which has been kind of our traditional model that we've used in the residence halls and even division-wide, often function in disparate parts where one hall might be doing something different than another hall, a department may be doing something different than another department. Curricular approaches really say, let's take a backwards design approach. What is it we want students to learn and then organize ourselves to do that? That's not really how universities have organized themselves in the past because they just kind of started doing things and adding more, and there was no one really coordinating that from the start. So if you use an analogy of the classroom, if you have an instructor who's building up their syllabus, they're going to build it in a very intentional kind of way. If you have a lot of people doing different lessons on maybe each day, it's going to be a little bit more of a program model style approach if you're not doing that coordination. Next slide. So as we get into talking about facilitation guides, these come into play in a curricular approach as it relates to an educational plan. Next slide. As you can see from this graphic that's coming up on the screen, the top portion discusses what are the goals and outcomes. You define an educational priority, what are our goals for that, what are some of the outcomes we set. We're not going to go over that today because that's going to be unique to your institutional campus. What we're really going to focus in on, next slide, is the bottom portion of this. What are the strategies, the methods by which we deliver these opportunities? If you're using a classroom analogy, you would think about this as an instructor thinking, am I going to do group work for this content? Or maybe it's an individual paper they have to write, or I'm going to lecture, or whatever other means that I may have available to me. That's what really strategies are. And in out-of-classroom contract, strategies would be things like develop a bulletin board or a marketing campaign or address this in a one-on-one conversation with a student. These are really our equivalents to the group work and the papers and the things of that sort that you'd find in the classroom. Next slide. Within these strategies, then, you define or create a facilitation guide, or sometimes called a lesson plan, that is the thing that usually an RA or any facilitator would use to put that activity together. So similar, again, using that classroom analogy, I'm an instructor, I'm going to teach tomorrow, so I'm going to have a lesson plan or a facilitation guide going into that has the basics of what I'm going to cover. And so in a curricular approach, when you create those facilitation guides, you're creating some kind of common consistency that any staff member can pick that up, look at it, contextualize it to maybe the unique situation that they have, contextualize it to their own individual teaching style, and then go forward. So facilitation guides are not meant to be followed as like a robot, one by one by one, but they are meant to give some consistency to the process. Next slide. So when you begin this facilitation guide process, think about all the different strategies and ways of interacting with students that you have available to you. These are going to form the basis of how you're going to develop these facilitation guides. Facilitation guides can be for just one strategy. They could span multiple strategies within it. It really depends on what is the best way of conveying some of this information. Next slide. The other thing to think about is what's the structure of that strategy? When I'm thinking of that classroom analogy, I might think that certain content is best discussed with a partner or is best done in a group work setting. That might push me towards that strategy. The same thing would happen when we look at the strategies that we have available to us. If we're going to do one-on-one conversations at regular points throughout the year, that means we can probably do some things that are build off of each successive one so they can be more cumulative. If they're a one-time event that we're not going to repeat again, those might privilege more knowledge type tasks or things specific to those outcomes at that moment. So think through how those strategies are structured, and that might also give you insight into how do you develop your facilitation guide. Next slide. So what does a facilitation guide look like? It can vary from campus to campus. Usually, though, it will contain a few main components. Usually, it will be given some type of title. You'll figure out what strategies you're going to use in that space. Do you have a target audience? Is it maybe just first-year students? Is it all students? Is it students of a particular major or students of a particular identity or students with a particular circumstance? For that facilitation guide, you're going to look back at your cascade. What are the broad goals and outcomes we have for all students, and where does this fit into that mix? And then what are the specific outcomes that we're going to address in this facilitation guide and basically in class here tonight when we do this facilitation guide? It then provides a purpose, which will give the facilitator a why am I doing this explanation, some kind of planning and preparation. What are any steps or things that they need to secure beforehand in order to do this? And then a guide that will give them the examples of the things they should actually facilitate in that moment. What's the content maybe that's been vetted that they should go over? What are some examples of, if we're going to do a team builder, what should that team builder be? This can really vary. It is not always meant to be highly, highly detailed, but is meant to give enough information to that facilitator and to ensure consistency when different folks will do this. The final piece would be an assessment. What is the assessment of the specific learning outcomes that we've set for this facilitation guide that we will know we were successful in this engagement endeavor if the students can answer these questions or can do the following things? So those are the main components of the facilitation guide. I'm going to show you two examples of just general ones. I pulled these off the internet. They are available widely. So next slide. This is one I found from Miami University. That talks about a lesson plan for a floor meeting. This one occurs just before Thanksgiving. They go through, say, here's why we're doing it. Here's how it connects to our goals and outcomes for the institution. Here's the goals and outcomes for this floor meeting right here that we're doing. And then it goes into the purpose and gives that, in this case, RA, the background information about why this one is important. Next slide. This one comes from Macalester College. Oops, excuse me. Oops, did I
think we had it in reverse.
I got them in reverse. Go back. Yeah. Go back for me, Tim. This one's from Macalester College. This is for orientation. And so they give their orientation leaders, again, here's the goals and outcomes we have, here's what we should do, and that creates the different orientation groups that will facilitate this, are the ones that will do the following common things. They may do more, they may do, it may take a different direction based off of that group, but at least we can ensure this is kind of the common things that will happen. So skip me ahead 2 slides, Tim. So this is where we want to transition, and I'm going to start to turn it over to Erin here and talking about planning for the unexpected. So we talked about curricular approaches, what they entail, and what facilitation guides are. Erin's going to talk a little bit about how she's worked with some things where you create a facilitation guide for something that you know is probably going to happen, but maybe you don't know exactly what that is. Erin?
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. So next slide, Tim. So some of the, in a less technologically fraught situation, I'd have you IM, but I'm going to be really honest, I'm a little bit scared that's going to knock me off. So some of the types of situations that we have found these things to be useful in working on a college campus, the University of Oklahoma deals with racist campus incidents. We deal with large ones. We deal with small ones in residential communities. Navigating right now we're navigating a lot of politicians visiting our campus. I'm sure there are quite a few people out there that are kind of dealing with that. We are navigating what it means for incidents of free speech to supersede community values, right? These are things that are not uncommon. And while I would love to say that our educational efforts at the front end are limiting those things from happening, we're not perfect, right? And our work is not going to cause those social shifts as quickly as I think we would all hope that could happen. So we also have certainly how do we talk about a flood even, right? There are definitely campus processes to talk about a flood in terms of like, this is what do we do with insurance and this is how we make a move and things like that. But then how do we help a disrupted community afterwards? These are all things when we came up with a list of how do we plan for the unplannable, we found that we actually could plan for that. Right? We actually did know exactly who we should call and how we should do those things. And when we are our best selves is when we should think about those things, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever had to deal with sort of a viral, really powerfully negative incident on your campus. But what I can tell you is that I am not my best self when that is happening, right? That is not when I should be doing my best thinking. I should be doing my best thinking when I have a lot of capacity, both emotional and physical, when I have time, right? That's when those things should be happening. And so we created roadmaps for ourselves so that when these things that we say are unplannable, but they're really not because we know that they are going to happen. We might not know the specifics of them, but we know that the actual thing is going to happen to us. Those are the things that we can create lesson guides facilitation guides in advance for. Next slide, Tim. So what you're seeing on your screen now is, I want to also make sure that I give a lot of credit and shout out to Quan Fan at the University of Oklahoma. Quan and I created these concepts, but this is all Quan's design work. If you are lucky enough to know Quan Fan, then this looks familiar to you. But what you're looking at is the top half of the cover sheet of every facilitation guide at the University of Oklahoma in the Department of Residence Life. So you can see that they've got their educational goals, they've got their different rubric levels. There's a space to list learning outcomes, things like that. But what these are based on is actually Kolb's experiential model, because we're big old theory nerds at the University of Oklahoma, and that made the most sense to us. And so we laid ours out in 4 different phases. But this is the top half that every single, the next couple slides you'll see are the cover sheet for what every single thing is going to be. Next slide, Tim. So the first that we understand in that experiential model is that there is a student experience that's happening. And so we talk about when we would use this particular facilitation guide. What you're seeing is the one that we use when a racist incident on campus harms students. If you read the Chronicle, you know that unfortunately the University of Oklahoma has a history with that, right? That's something that we know that we will have to navigate with our students. We also know that we're not alone in that. And so we chose this one in hopes that it could be helpful for folks on this call as well, or on this webinar as well. In this experience one, we highlight where we know the literature is, we highlight what we know we need to be doing. Next slide. We also offer a space for some reflection. We, in most of our facilitation guides, we hope for a reflective point. We understand that reflection leads to learning. And so this piece is a little different though when we're dealing with a large campus incident, because that might not be where we are yet. We might not be in a space to reflect yet, but we throughout the guide have provided some different spots for students to engage in that, also for faculty and staff to engage in that. I don't want to act like students are the only ones harmed when that happens on our campuses. But an effort to make sure that people are using good judgment to know when that is. Next slide. Every facilitation guide has to have an action, right? Learning is not passive and requires some sort of action. And so we give in our front cover page, give a short snippet of what that action will be. Next slide. And then on that cover sheet, we also add that assessment component that Paul talked about, that if we're not assessing what we're doing, then we're not really sure that it's working, first of all. And second of all, we are not closing that loop. We're not being good practitioners and practicing solid pedagogical sort of practices there. All right, so that's our cover sheet. Next slide.
And there's one thing too, Erin, I mean, talking about assessment that I just want to interject. What's difficult with assessment and these unplanned things is because you don't know the details, it's really hard to preset assessment questions because you don't know what it is that you want yet students to learn. So that is particularly difficult in this case. You might be able to identify some broad things, especially if you know it's a racist incident. Maybe you do want students to recognize racist incidents. Could be one of your learning outcomes. But there's probably some things that are very contextual to that specific thing that you're not going to know what that assessment question is that you want answered until you're in it.
Absolutely. And so we know that we imagine that our assessment will likely not be a survey, right? Like we know that those are, we can pre-think that there are likely some sort of methods that we wouldn't want to use. But you're absolutely right that the actual specificity of both the assessment and potentially even the learning outcome isn't there yet. This is the sort of how to and care, right? And so because of the nature of this kind of incident, we provided this one. We provide all of our facilitation guides in a timeline. Like you should think about this the week before, right? Because often we're handing off facilitation guides to student leaders, to peer educators, to resident advisors and assistants. This one probably wouldn't be handed off that way, right? This one probably stays at a professional staff level. But when we're writing our facilitation guides in general, they're written in a timeline so that when I hand this off to a student who is going to facilitate learning that is appropriate to their developmental level and their facilitation skills, right? I do have to remind them that a week before they do need to remember to put up publicity. As much as I would love to not have to do that, that is a critical component, right? So this step-by-step instruction actually starts with it, like the incident is like the moment, right? Because we're not pre-planning on we don't know when those are going to hit us. And so it gives a step-by-step for like within 8 to 12 hours, we're going to do these things. Next slide. Within 24 hours, we want to make sure that we've committed to we're going to do these things. We're going to think about this way in the way that we're providing large scale community access. Who are our campus partners is a critical component to talk about here, because I want them to know, right? We shared these facilitation guide. If you see here that within 24 hours, our campus partners are fitness and recreation and university counseling center. Within 48 hours, it's marketing and communications and our webcom team. We shared these facilitation guides with them when they were built, right? So they also know that this is coming and they know what the Division of Student Affairs and Residence Life will be doing in response. Some of that is going to be completely tweaked by the nature of the incident or what's happening, but our campus partners know what our general plan is. Next slide. This is sort of, we kept going, so this is within 72 hours. Who are we continuing to work with? How is this happening? How are we supporting our students? And then next slide. And it keeps going, right? I think that a lot of people, it's easy to think that viral sort of acts of racism, it's easy for dominant majorities on campus when the cameras are done or when it stops being talked about in the newspaper or something like that to believe that those incidents are sort of over, right? But we know both from literature in our own work and from the different ways that that marginalized and minoritized communities have explained, the world to us from the jump is that that's not the case, right? And so continuing to create support structures and different ways that we can be showing up for weeks after that incident, because it will likely take through the rest of the academic year, to be honest, to do any level of recovery or to move students into healing space versus just an immediate sort of action space.
The other thing to think about too is, one of the essential elements of a curriculum is continuous review and utilizing a kind of a cyclical process for improving your curriculum overall. What this may do for you is highlight that you're not doing the ongoing educational work before this incident to occur, so that when it does occur, your students are in a better place, you're in a better place, so that you're prepared to deal with it. So if you go through it and you're like, gosh, maybe we need to build this into our regularly occurring curriculum so that when the incident happens, we're not caught flat-footed, but the students have some language or they have some tools already to deal with it. that can also help. Like, I'll give the example of UMBC does a lot of work with restorative practices, restorative justice, if you're familiar with those concepts. And so they're equipping their students with tools on how to deal with conflict and certain incidences from the start of their curriculum. So if this were to then happen, you already had something to build off of, and so these can also be great places to highlight what should we be doing in our quote unquote main curriculum to be in advance of these things.
Absolutely. I think, Paul, you nailed it, that the first time we deployed one of these, it certainly highlighted the gaps, right? Or highlighted the gaps perhaps in our plan in terms of, well, we were going to talk about some of this stuff, like that was like week 7, but this happened in week 2. So how do we advance, right? And so some of those things are you're at the mercy of a calendar, right? And we're at the mercy of bad decision making sometimes. Let's just call it what that is. So, but these things are happening on our college campuses daily, and being prepared to engage with them is also critical. What I will say in response to that also is my staff knowing that these existed before anything happened, right? So we shared these facilitation guides with every level of staff prior to, a school year. That means that they knew we had a plan, right? They didn't necessarily remember the whole plan. They didn't have it memorized, but knowing that we had a plan that they had once upon a time seen, and once upon a time been like, yeah, I'm into that. Our resident advisor stuff very specifically, that helped them. That helped them also in those moments when they were like, I don't know how we're going to do this. And they were like, wait, no, we already do know. It will still be hard and it will still be challenging, but we already do have a plan for how some of this can happen. Tim, next slide. When we think about things to remember with this, we also just tried to list like an ongoing list of things that we could consider to be pitfalls, right? And this is not exhaustive. This could be added to in multiple ways and spaces. These were just sort of the first, and likely are after every time one of these is used, we have a debrief over it a few weeks later and talk about what worked and what didn't, what needs to change, what needs tweaking. Who did we forget to include? We're never going, even when we do our best thinking, when we're at our best selves, we're not going to get it right 100% of the time. And like Paul talked about, that essential element of review means that we didn't just write this, deploy it, and then put it back in a binder and be like, glad we had that, right? You have to debrief it and make sure that it's still working, it's still functional, and that it contributed to some sort of solution building, or contributed to moving students, in this case, or for this example, contributed to moving students toward a healing space. It just can't go back onto the shelf. All right, Tim, next slide. So we have a few minutes left, mostly because Paul and I talked at the speed of light, so you're welcome. But we have a few minutes left to engage in some case study practice. And so what we thought about were some different ways and spaces that these things could be used. There are certainly, you can ask us questions in the chat box or with the question mark, or you could raise your hand, absolutely. But Tim, if you'll go advance us to that next slide. These are some of the things that we have seen. We have seen pre-built facilitation guides or pre-built plans, certainly really work for different campus communities. And so if you want to, however you are, if you're alone at your desk, or if you're using your lunch hour, if you're Central Time, and learning with colleagues, like this would be a great time to maybe think about some different ways that these things, that these facilitation guides could be helpful in these specific instances.
So what we'll do is we're going to turn it over to you for about 5 minutes. You can use this to discuss with peers if you're with peers. You can also, if there's questions that you want to ask, as Erin mentioned, throw them into the chat so that we can see them. And I'm having us, we're right now 11 minutes past the hour. So at about 16 minutes past the hour, we will come back in and we will start going through those questions. So You can reflect on these case studies, send in some questions, and then we'll reach towards the end of the webinar with those questions. All right, Tim, next slide, please. So we'll go into the Q&A portion here. According to Tim, we didn't have any questions come in through the chat yet. which is fine. So why don't we, if you still have one, go ahead and put it in there. Otherwise, we've just got a few wrap-up things for the resources that you can take from this point forward that can help you out. Next slide. So we mentioned in terms of ongoing support for this, the Institute on the Curricular Approach is coming up this October in Anaheim. But next October, so we're looking at 2020 now, it will be in Baltimore. So depending on where you live geographically, that may be even a little more convenient for you or less convenient. But registration for that is already open. So you can find that through the ACPA website. So if that is something that you want to take advantage of, that's a great place to learn and engage with other colleagues about this topic. One thing I will mention, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. You were maybe going to say the same thing.
Well, and one thing we've learned is that the Institute does fill up, which is what happened this year. In fact, there's well over triple digits in the wait list. So if you do intend to go, we always say registering earlier is better. In terms of online resources that you can find, residentialcurriculum.com is a page that I maintain that has a number of different resources, things that I produce, but also things that I find produced by others. I try to keep it all together at that web address. So that's a great resource of all the different things that you may want to access related to curriculum. There is also a Facebook group called Residential Curriculum and Curricular Approaches that you can join. That's fairly large and actually fairly active. And on Twitter or through your platform of choice, the hashtag ACPA-ICA, as in Institute on the Curricular Approach, so ACPA-ICA, is also one that's utilized for sharing resources, primarily on Twitter, but I think you may occasionally get an Instagram photo here and there if that's your jam. So, Erin, anything you wanted to add?
No, I think you nailed it. Friends, heed our call. Register early if you want to go to Baltimore, like pre-August early. And we will either see you in Anaheim or in Baltimore next year.
Great. And that's all for our webinar today. I don't know, Tim, if you had anything that you wanted to conclude with.
Hi, everyone. This is Tim with ACPA. We want to thank you all very much for attending today's online learning event. This room will stay open for about another half hour. If you want to connect with other people who had participated in this webinar, just click on their thumbnail and you can engage with them in that way. So at this time, the webinar is ending, and thank you all very much for being here. We appreciate it.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.